And now, with pretty much everything else done, it's time to sand the guitar. The angles are all in the headstock, the neck is shaped to the right dimensions, the heel is shaped now, and basically my job is to sand the entire thing until it's completely scratch free and ready for pore filling. There's not a lot to talk about here, obviously. I'm going to start with 80 grit sandpaper and then sand all the way through to 220, and then when I get to 220 I'll put in my pore filler, and I'll explain that at the time. The only thing I might mention is a little useful technique which you can use for difficult areas like this. You get a strip of sandpaper and you put some tape on the back, a bit of sticky tape or something. What you can do is you can put your finger against it, pull the sandpaper through, and that lets you get into difficult spots. So that's just one little technique. The tape on the back stops the sandpaper coming apart and gives it longevity, and you can use that all over. For example, on the headstock, if you have a difficult spot, just use it up there. Anyway, time to sand the whole guitar, which will take me about 2 days. But the point of this exercise is that the nicer the finish on the body, the nicer everything is, the easier it's going to be to finish, and the nicer it will look when it's done. See you in a couple of days. Right, now it's time for some pore filling. The entire guitar has been sanded up to 240 grit actually, and now I've cleaned it with naphtha so the pores are all cleaned out. I've taped off the fingerboard and the headstock and the 2 small holes where the bridge is attached. Everything else will get pore filled, although I'll probably try and keep it out of the pickup and rear control cavity. The pore filling stuff is a glass microbead mix, which is basically, a good thing about this is it doesn't shrink back as it dries. And what I do is I smooth this goop on all over the guitar, and it fills up those pores so that later on, after it's hardened and I sand it, I get a lovely smooth surface. So let's just goop on some stuff and spread it using some spatula-y things. You don't want to let the goop sit in one spot for too long, because what will happen if you do that is you'll get a stain, like a water stain. Got to be a little bit careful. Best to work this stuff fairly quickly. And here's the guitar with its pore filler on, sitting, or rather hanging, in my kitchen. Now we work the dye in, or the stain in, all around the edges, and it's actually astonishingly giving me exactly the colour I want, which is really good. Now this particular recipe is a kind of combination of red, it's mostly red, lots and lots and lots of red in fact, tons of red, but then just to give it a little bit of variety we put in a little brown and a very small amount of blue, which is of course a way of getting a mild sort of purplish effect, which is exactly what I want, and miraculously exactly what I have. Huh, how about that? Okay, Now here you can see the body that has been, well, it's had a few layers of lacquer here. It's been taped up in the important holes. And what I've been doing is simply spraying lacquer. This is the stuff. This is actually Japanese nitrocellulose lacquer. I use rattle cans, and it's very cheap, but it's proper nitrocellulose. And what I do is I spray some coats, I leave it for a while, I spray a few more coats, and after I've built up a bunch of coats, what I'm going to do is actually sand it back with, I don't know, probably to about 300 grit or something like that. So I've got a flat surface all over, and then I'm actually going to spray it some more. So what I'll do essentially is put on a bunch of coats which will act as a kind of filler, again, to supplement the pore filler and be a sanding sealer and all that stuff. And then I'll put on more lacquer, and the extra lacquer will actually become the level that actually becomes buffed and polished. Good thing about nitrocellulose is that each layer melts into the other layers, so that when you polish it you've got this beautiful clean surface. And already we've got the colour that I wanted from this guitar, so I'm very happy with the way it's looking. Now we're at a kind of important stage in the finishing process. Basically what I'm doing is the guitar has had a bunch of layers of lacquer, but they've then been scraped smooth. I did this with some sandpaper, with a razor blade, the whole thing. The idea is to add a little bit extra to the effect of the pore filler. So you can see when I do this, what I'm doing is I'm creating a smoother surface. And over this, I'm now going to spray quite a few more coats of lacquer. So essentially, the pore filler fills up the pores. Then this acts, I guess you might say, as a sanding sealer. And then when the lacquer goes on, a bunch of coats of that, and that gets sanded flat, we should get a much clearer, nicer surface. So we're about halfway through the finishing process. So I'm going to put on lots of layers of lacquer, and then this guitar is going to sit for a few weeks before final sanding and assembly. So here's the guitar. It's hanging up. It's got all of its lacquer on now, so really what it needs to do is just dry. And that's a process of, I think about 6 or 8 weeks. It'll just sit here and the lacquer will gradually harden. Then I'll polish it up, install all the hardware, and we'll be good to go. So basically, except for a final polishing and the installation of the hardware, this guitar is done.